evening, everyone. Thank you for coming here this evening for the first talk in our Women in Power speaker series to celebrate the launch of Edeline Lee on this floor at Fenwick. My Autumn-Winter 2019 collection was inspired by Mary Beard's manifesto, Woman and Power, in which she equates public voice with power and the suppression of the female voice as the ancient historical source point of misogyny. We, fashion designers, often speak of powerful women. Yet, the fashion system is such that we most often show our work on young and silent girls. As a reaction, I showed this collection at London Fashion Week last February as a forum for powerful women's voices. We had 35 women orators of all disciplines, including the distinguished financier and campaigner for equal pay and opportunities, Dame Helena Morrissey, who is kindly here with us this evening. I also have the pleasure of introducing to you Clarissa Farr, for more than a decade the High Mistress of St. Paul Girls' School and an expert on the education of our children. It is an incredible privilege to hear both of your perspectives on the topic of beauty versus brains. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Edeline. Good evening, everybody. It is a huge pleasure to be here, and it was a great privilege to take part in Edeline's very groundbreaking fashion show. Will stick in my memory as one of the great highlights of lots of speaking engagements. So thank you, Edeline, and thank you for bringing us here together tonight. Now, I first met Clarissa when I went along to St. Paul's School for Girls and gave a talk to the very intelligent, scarily intelligent, sixth form girls, and we had a lovely lunch afterwards, and we stayed in touch. And afterwards, of course, I was intrigued to see then you written a book, The Making of Her. You can buy it there after. And I was mentioned in it, and there's an issue around the beauty versus brains topic. So I wanted to kick off things tonight and just ask you, Clarissa, what made you write the book, and to expand a little bit on what you intended to say. It might not have been quite reported in that way.
Thank you, Helena, and thank you, Edeline, for that introduction. It's lovely to be here this evening. Great to reconnect with Helena, and lovely to meet all of you as well, and to be wearing these beautiful clothes. And I should just apologise, I'm just clashing slightly with the chair. That wasn't planned.
I think that's a cool combination.
But this is the rust I'm wearing this evening, so beware. Yes, as Helena said, I had a wonderful time as High Mistress of St. Paul's with 750 of the most incredible, most intelligent, and definitely not silent, by the way, in their case, young women. And after 10 years of that, I felt that I had so much experience of them, of their parents, of their teachers, that I had a lot to unpack, and I wanted to put that down in a book. And one of the themes that resonates quite strongly through the book is, if you like, the difference between what young women in a school like St. Paul's learn to expect of the workplace, the sense of self that they develop, and then the shock that they experience when they go out into the world of work and they find that it's not necessarily as equal and as empowering as they had expected it to be. So there's this kind of ignition point where they find themselves surrounded by often powerful men, influential men. They have this very strong sense of confidence, headlamps full on, ready to express their opinions, and sometimes find it more difficult than they expected to do that. So that turned out to be a point in the book that prompted quite a lot of interest. And to go to Helena's point about beauty and brains, I make the point that somehow as a society we have a bit of difficulty with forming an acceptable vision of powerful women. Whereas I think for men who've been used to, if you like, treading the corridors of power for many generations, your appearance is not such a factor. For women who, throughout history, let's face it, have had to get used to being the ones who are looked at, the way you look as a woman is, you might say, more important perhaps than it should be in today's world. So we've come together tonight to have an exciting discussion around that, and I've no doubt many other issues to do with how women are making their way in the world today. But Helena has also written a book, so we're doing a little shout out for each other here. Helena's book is also available in paperback now, because she's a little bit further ahead of me with her book publishing life. And I think we're both very much focused on how young women make their way, what the workplace needs to do, and how it needs to change to be really propitious for them and all their talents. And of course, Helena is a fabulous role model in the world of business for those young women. So tell us a bit about your book and how you came to write it.
Thank you. So, well, first of all, we're not very diverse in terms of our colour choices, are we? I thought, when I arrived, oh, my book's not there. Oh, yes, my book is there, but it's, very strange coincidence. So we obviously agree on many things. The reason why I wrote a book, A Good Time to Be a Girl, and actually the hardback had the subtitle, Don't Lean In, Change the System, which ended up being a bit like your beauty versus brains concept, a bit more controversial than originally intended, and people thought it was a bit of a dig at Sheryl Sandberg, which it wasn't so much intended to be, except for that I did feel, and the reason why I wrote the book then, was that I think we're on the verge of a huge opportunity to make a big breakthrough when it comes to balancing out. So not just women progressing at the expense of men, but actually men having more choices in their lives as well. And I think the reasons for that, I mean, I set up something called the 30% Club, which is about 9 years old now. It feels a lot longer in some ways. And that was deliberately focused on just one tiny little part of the whole gender inequality issue. And that was on trying to see more women in the corporate boardroom. And now, 9 years later, we've gone from 9.5% women across the top 350 companies' boards in this country to over 30%. Finally, about a month ago, which is very exciting. But it did show me that if you can push on the door at the moment when people are wanting change, and this change was led by men, actually, the people who really changed the boardroom were the chairs of the boards. And it wasn't just that they were vaguely supportive, they actually championed women because they thought it was in their own interest, really. They would have better decision-making, better boardrooms. And that's something I think sometimes when we're talking about women's progression, we get a bit distracted, a bit disillusioned perhaps by the incremental progress. There's a sense of real unfinished business, and it ends up being quite confrontational with men often. Whereas actually, I think that we can get much further when we work together. And I would just love to see a realization that we can create the world that we want to live in as well, that we, in our numbers and with huge numbers of wonderful, not just highly educated, but very successful women, we just need to push a bit further and a bit faster, and we will get there. But I'm quite interested to explore one thing in your book, or lots of things in your book, but you set up Dads for Daughters at St. Paul's when you were High Mistress. By the way, I think High Mistress is like the best job title ever. I aspire to be a High Mistress or something, but anyway, in the meantime, I won't be a High Mistress or anything, but a bit jealous on that one. But the Dads for Daughters, tell us a little bit more about that, because it sounds so similar to this idea of, having chairmen sort of, fight for women.
Well, Helena, a very interesting question, and I think the answer chimes very much with your observation that nowadays men are more getting into the idea that they need to get behind empowerment for women, because actually it's all about working together rather than women, if you like, being in some sort of adversarial position with men. I was very interested to explore how the fathers of the girls at St. Paul's felt about women's empowerment, because it was obvious in a sense that because they had a daughter at the school, they were, by definition, interested in the future of women and women doing well. They were, if you like, already invested in that, but through their daughters. And the more I started to read about this, the more I realised there'd been quite a lot of research done already amongst male CEOs, for example, showing that where men in positions of power have daughters, they are much more likely to promote women. They're much more likely to be empathetic towards the cause of women's empowerment in a professional context through, if you like, their own bloodline and the instincts that brings out. And when I reached out to the fathers at St. Paul's to say, okay, guys, you've got all this power, all this experience of the business world. Tell us what you feel about how we can make things more equal for women. Tell us about some of the practices going on in your businesses that promote the interests of young women coming into your particular arena. They were delighted to share those ideas. I had a number of them write articles for our newsletter about reverse mentoring and one or two other very interesting initiatives that they were engaged with. So we realized there was a real passion there. And so we formed Dads for Daughters, and a movement, if you like, to get men with daughters behind the issue of workplace empowerment. So in a sense, the proposition was, well, it's an unequal world at the moment. Men have more power. Let's harness that power. Let's use that positively to bring on and open up the opportunities for girls. And that's how Dads for Daughters was born, if you like. And we brought all the dads into school with their daughters one evening, and they just had a great time being together, thinking about the future of that daughter, father being asked, not why he was in the way, but how he could help. And it unlocked something very, very positive in the men. And that was where I think I began to realise what Helena's already talked about, was that if you approach it in the right way, men, and including men in that older generation where you might think they're not so in touch with what modern women are thinking, actually are very sympathetic to that mission. And I think it's just reminded me how we very much need to work together, as Helena's been saying. But Helena, tell us, do you think, what do you think about the idea that women are bringing something very different to the boardroom? Do men and women really have different qualities? What do you think about that?
So I do believe, and there's a chapter in my book that's called "Equal Men, Women, Equal but Different," and I know you talk quite a bit in your book as well about what the difference is, because I think we're struggling personally to say that we're all the same. I mean, you go into any social situation and the women will be all chatting to each other, the men will all be chatting to each other. We like different things. I think we do, on average. I'm not saying that everybody is exactly the same, obviously, but that we do, on average, have slightly different aptitudes. I'm a mother of 9 children. It'll bound to come up at some stage in the conversation. So I just get that on the table before we go any further. I'm a granny to 2. Anyway, very proud of that because I just have a new granddaughter. Anyway, 6 girls, 3 boys. So I feel I have enough of a sample size to be very, very confident about the fact that just the slight differences, and they do, I don't want to say over-exaggerate it, but I think it's something that we should celebrate, not sort of try to hide. And it's one of the reasons why I've always espoused, we should be, in the workplace, we should be feminine, and we should be happy about being feminine. We shouldn't be trying to be honorary men. And honestly, I don't think we're really making the most of diversity, which for me means all about diversity of thought, having different perspectives that will make better decisions. If we just say, okay, you can join our company, but then you've just got to be like all the other guys, or all the black people have got to be all like the white people, gays like the straights. We're not going to actually enhance what we're doing. The 30% Club came about because of the financial crisis. It was born out of this disaster that you can argue, and the regulators did argue, was because there wasn't enough challenge in the boardroom. And obviously that means that people need to be strong enough and have confidence in their own opinions to challenge the status quo. And that was a moment to seize, but it's completely snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. If you say to the women who join the boardroom, actually, please behave just like the men. And I don't think it's complete yet. I think a lot of women who join the corporate boards in particular feel a lot of pressure. They're still in the minority. They feel a lot of pressure to conform. And it is a hard thing to do. And it is hard to speak up and to and not just to adopt the trappings of an old definition of power. And that's something that Mary Beard talks about a lot. The nature of power is changing. And that goes into my theme about why we now have this unprecedented opportunity to make greater progress, because I don't think it's anything controversial to say, political power is dismantled in front of our eyes. Mainstream leaders in business, politics, in society are struggling to make their voices heard unless they connect with people. We women are great at connecting with people, and we should really make the most of that. It's a good time to be a woman as well as a girl. But Clarissa, the other thing I was particularly... I've killed them. No, I'm back. Was, when we go back to... We don't want to shy away from anything controversial here. We want to talk about some of the things that are difficult. You, going back to the thing about the brains versus beauty, I think you were probably mischaracterized. When I read your book again, I was thinking, I missed that bit. It seemed that you were saying that actually women are more treated badly in the press often, that they are caricatured unfairly, and that might make women less shrill, less talking about their ideas, and more people like me and Sheryl Sandberg. You said we weren't so much out there in the press saying the controversial things, so we didn't get caricatured, and arguably we were there partly because we had a sort of presence, and some of that was looks. Let's expand on that a little bit, because I think it is something that everyone's here because they love fashion, they love Edeline's clothes, another advert. But how important is it that we continue to present ourselves in a certain way? Is there latitude on how we can dress and look?
Delighted to come back to that point. I think just to put it in a slightly broader context to start with, I do feel, and we were saying this to each other before the session started, that we are living today in a very, very visual world. I don't know how many of you have children or who might have children thinking about university, but a degree course that exists now, for example, is visual culture. That's the title of a degree. Well, you couldn't do that degree 30 years ago. It didn't exist. So the whole focus of society is very, very much privileging the sight, how things look, over the other senses. If we took ourselves back many generations, I'm an English literature teacher, so I always have to get Shakespeare into any talk that I do. And if we went back to Shakespeare's time, the way people apprehended the world was through smell, through the way things sounded. The dominance of sight, which is particular to the modern world, wasn't the case then. And if you think about how much time we spend on those wretched little devices that you all have in your handbags turned off now in a day, and our screens, you're reminded how looking at the world in this very, very visually dominated way, and often through the flat screen where we're not engaging with things in 3 dimensions or in human terms, but in these very, if you like, minimalist and rather reductive terms. I think there are issues there about why we think about the world in the way that we do, and maybe there's an issue there about why we've got so many problems with mental health amongst the young as well, which is maybe a whole topic for another conversation. But the point Helena's making about the book was more that I think we do have a problem as a society with how we see female power. If you think, I obviously have a bit of a complex about how people see headmistresses and have been trying to get away from that caricature for some time.
We have to share that there was one dress that Clarissa tried on earlier, which she said made her look very schoolmarmy. So I can, you don't mind me saying that, do you? We said, okay, not that one then. It didn't, but anyway, I think schoolmarmy look is a very,
Helena, not on
well, I don't know what that says about me, but...
Yes, I was just going to give the example of, I don't know if you remember when Theresa May was Prime Minister, and I was keenly interested in her education policy. When she suggested at one point that we might bring back grammar schools, there were lots of caricatures of her in the newspaper the next day as the sort of harridan headmistress with the big shoulder pads and the long nose and the sort of Cruella de Vil kind of demeanour. So we find when we're thinking about women and power, we often revert to caricature because we find it rather difficult to think about that. And I was making the point in the book that there are certain women, very beautiful women, who don't need to make a lot of noise to be powerful, who have their amazing ability and their quietude and don't need that. And Helena and Sheryl, I did name as examples of those kinds of women who, if you like, break that mold. But I think it is a problem in the sense that because of this dominance of the visual, and because of the fact that still in an unequal world, many of the decisions about promotion and so on are being made by men. If you're a woman, you plot your career through a sequence of largely male approvals still. And the way you look is too big a part of that still, is really what I was saying, I think.
I have to share a couple of little anecdotes. So one was when this newspaper articles were seizing upon this relatively small aspect of your book, in all honesty, and sort of blowing it up in a big way of a controversial topic, as if it was. My husband just said, just totally, they know how people do when they're married to you, very sort of, he said, the thing is, you're not even that good looking. And I said, thanks. So I haven't even got my looks now. So we had this ridiculous argument about that. And then he said, well, you should point out the fact, so many ugly people who are successful. I said, that's a really also bad idea. Anyway, so we did, but we laughed so much about it that it was worth it, to be honest. I talk in my book about how I've always enjoyed fashion and clothes. As a 5-year-old, my mother used to say I changed about 10 times before breakfast because I enjoyed trying. I must have tried on my whole wardrobe. But I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think if you're in control of that, or if you're not feeling you're being dictated to, then that's good. It goes back to my point about that I think we should enjoy being women, enjoy, living lives as ourselves, if at all possible.
I couldn't agree more. And just to sort of finally deal with the point about the book, it was entirely meant in a complimentary way to Helena, absolutely, and to Cheryl. I think the whole question of how you look as a professional woman is a really interesting one. Certainly one that, as a headmistress, a high mistress, I was extremely aware of. If you're the head of a school, the girls there are aged between 11 and 18. They're always aged between 11 and 18, but you, surprise, surprise, have birthdays and you move on. So you move away from them in age, but your relationship with them stays the same. So I think I was very aware. They were certainly very aware of what I wore and how I presented myself. And I was very aware of that needing to be appropriate, accessible, trying to get away from the stereotypical Harridan headmistress sort of caricature, but also to model something about a way of being appropriate, of being timeless, and sending some messages to them about dressing for your situation as well. I have very vivid memories of the very independent Pauliners going off to work experience in an investment bank in a bustier one day. I think, okay, well, let's see how that goes. Well, she was back by 10 o'clock, having been told, no, you don't come in here like that. So learning about appropriate personal presentations, important part of education for men and women, for boys and girls. I think, now that women, in a sense, have so many more choices in what they wear than men do in contemporary society, which, by the way, was not always the case at all. It presents challenges for women. What looks okay, what doesn't look okay. What do you think, Helena?
No, I think in lots of ways we're very liberated now compared when I started working in the city. I mean, I have to confess, I bought this very boring navy blue suit with a white shirt, and I only wore it for the interviews. I felt a bit like I was lying a bit, I was presenting myself to be very conventional. But I think it has, thanks to designers like Edeline and others that have really allowed people to dress women to take advantage. Not all do, though. And I've spoken at events where people have said, well, wearing pink, and I hasten to add, I wasn't wearing sort of top-to-toe fuchsia, but, I had a sort of stripe, and they said, no, I couldn't do that. I'm in a law firm. I said, why? This is a fake rule. It's a new thing, fake news, we have fake rules. And I think we are very hidebound sometimes, and we should try to push the envelope out a little bit. It doesn't require a revolution, necessarily. I was intrigued, Clarissa, that you talked in your book about 2 teachers that had influenced you when you were at school. And I'm not sure how much you were conscious of this, but you described one as very formidable, who you did credit with giving you a love of English literature. I think it's called Mrs. Gray. And then you talked about another younger, you said gentler, teacher who you admired their slim figure, their nice clothes, their handsome fiancé, and so forth. It was quite interesting, actually, that it had obviously been an influence on you, and perhaps that was something that you've carried on because of those teachers. That we're all products, aren't we, of what's happened to us in our lives, and perhaps that you aspired to be like the younger, gentler one.
I don't know. I think role models are very important, but I think that point reminds me that my experience is that young women are very discerning, and that in their eyes, if we're thinking about beauty and brains, beauty alone would never be enough. And they might set themselves high standards in terms of their personal appearance, and I might be concerned that they're too worried about that sometimes, and that their self-confidence is too readily undermined because they can't necessarily meet what they see as a very narrow idea of female beauty. I was reading some research about this the other day, saying that the young women, the generation of our daughters, for example, see more images of ideal beauty, ideal feminine beauty in a day than my mother would have seen in her entire adolescence. So again, it's this visual bombardment of images of the ideal that is very, very dangerous in a way for young women. So I think having good role models is important. I think on the whole they're much too smart and too discerning to be impressed only by what's visual, but that doesn't prevent them having sometimes a sense of insecurity when secretly they're looking in the mirror. And of course they're looking in the mirror again much more often than their grandmothers were. And by the way, of course, the ideal woman today, if you pick up a fashion magazine, is a very different shape from the ideal woman in 1900. So all those things have changed. It's more pressurizing for girls, but I think probably for boys actually to some extent as well. We both have sons. I only have the one, but I wonder, Helena, what do you think about young men today and what they're facing?
So I think it's a very important part of the whole discussion, because I think often, and understandably, we've been very much focused on the women's side of the gender equality equation. Particularly in the recent decade, I think, where there's been a huge intensity of focus on it. And obviously what we've been trying to do is level the playing field, but in the meantime, we've perhaps forgotten inadvertently sometimes that there's two sides to that equation. And what does it mean to be a modern man in today's world? And I have to credit my husband, who 20 years ago, when we had our fourth child, he was the one who said, I'd like to go freelance. He was a journalist. And obviously that's made a huge difference to the ability that I've had to forge a career. And in all honesty, I thought at the time it was quite a sort of normal conversation, that we were just being sensible and thinking about how could we make it work. And, we were struggling both with full-time jobs up until that point, and who was earning the most and who had better career prospects. And it just happened to be me at that time. 2 years earlier, it could have been him. And he did that at a time when it was very unusual to be a father at the school gate. And I think he did have not a crisis of confidence, but it certainly impacted him. And he used to say to me, I just hate going to any social occasion where people will ask me, the first question is, what do you do? And he said, what do I say? And anyway, we did have a laugh about it eventually, because I'd say to him, what are you doing today? Because he would reinvent himself. In fact, now he's, this is not something he would probably be grateful for me saying, but anyway, he is a very religious person, and always has been, but he has also been very exploratory in his religion. And at one stage he was ordained a Buddhist priest, and he now is in all newspaper articles about me. They describe him as a Buddhist priest. But he is now a Christian again. And in fact, he said to me today, he said, Millie, said 20-year-old that he stopped work to look after, said the other day you were saying, yes, well, Dad was a Buddhist for like 10 minutes. And and yet, heaven forbid either of us died tomorrow, his obituary, you probably wouldn't get one. And yet he's made a huge impact on so many people's lives, and now grandchildren and partners of our children. The multiplication sums are a bit daunting sometimes. But, our definition of success has to change, I think. I mean, I think ultimately we're just going to make ourselves miserable by sort of aspiring to things that we don't necessarily want to do. And for me, equality will only happen once we actually, men have more choices as well, that they don't feel straitjacketed by societal expectations. And only then will women be able to, if they want, and if they have the opportunity, take advantage of more career or be more fulfilled in their careers. So it's a two-way street.
Yes, that's so interesting what you say about your husband's experience. It's making me think that just as there needs to be a modern femininity where it's okay for women not to wear the suit and the white shirt, but to wear a dress and to feel that I can still have authority and I can still be powerful and I can still be effective in my leadership role, and if you like, be true to my femininity and my particular authentic sense of being a woman that's special to me. Doesn't have to be fixed like any particular magazine shot, but my own way of being that is okay. Similarly, there's got to be a redefinition of what modern masculinity looks like. So, if you like, the pastorally sensitive, the emotionally intelligent, the motherly father needs to be also an acceptable version of masculinity. I think this very much plays out. It'd be interesting to hear Helena's perspective, but in terms of how career couples manage parenthood in relation to their own work trajectory, I think although there is legislation now to encourage men to take parental leave and for it to be possible for them to participate in bringing their children up, it's not so acceptable culturally in all businesses for the men to do that, and there is still a fear that, you know, if you take time off to look after small children, you're less of a guy in some way and you're not going to be as promotable when you come back, whereas we all know, those of us who have anything to do with young people, that being a parent is extremely additive to your professional skill set, patience, endurance, problem solving, stamina, etc., negotiation, and so on. So, do you think how far have we got? Do you think, Helena, in terms of having that more modern masculinity accepted? When you think about your work colleagues who are men,
so I'm very encouraged about this. I've seen so much evidence. Last year, took part in or spearheaded something called Equal Lives, which was a survey of 10,000, mostly men with caring responsibilities and careers. Now, they weren't all children that they were looking after. A lot of the time it was elderly parents, and there were some very poignant stories of, you know, men who were the only person that their elderly father would see during the week, and yet they felt culturally, going back to your point, that although the policies were in place for their employer, the culture wasn't supportive of that. So they hid it from their employers. But 90% of those men said that they felt, the fathers felt, that they should play as big a part in their children's upbringing as their wives. And yesterday, within the investment industry, which is like lowest of the low in terms of any sort of diversity at all, only 4% of money managed in this country is managed exclusively by women. We could only find, when we did a census, 12 black fund managers. Great excitement. We found another one the other day. But you know, we scored very, very badly. But yesterday we had this huge seminar on smart working, agile working, flexible working. Not quite as many men as women in the room, but a lot of men, a lot of powerful men in the industry saying, actually, this is all about being modern. This is actually all about being relevant to future generations of talent, whether they be male or female. And this is what we see. They showed a statistic, company, social enterprise called TimeWise, which suggested that 92% of the next generation, so they haven't quite entered the workforce, but when they canvass them, they all want work-life balance, 92% of men and women. There's no difference between the male and the female response. So it's quite an exciting moment, but we have to see it for what it is, I think. I see a lot of people still extrapolate, you know, slow pace of progress, and just assume that there's too many barriers. I do think we can't be passive about it and just wait. And one thing I did want to pick up on before we perhaps throw the open to the floor, because we'd love to answer your questions, is whether you think education is getting it right. I mean, you talk about some of the perhaps limitations on girls-only education because they're not necessarily prepared for the the disappointments in the workplace when it might not be quite as objective as exams. But also boys' education is, perhaps not preparing young men for having a fuller part in family life.
Yes, I think often people think that a school should reflect society, that education to be relevant, to be appropriate, should be somehow a microcosm. A school should be a microcosm of the real world, the so-called real world. I don't really believe that. I think that schools are, if you like, a laboratory in which you experiment and you try things out and you find out who you are, and those are places which need to be in a way ahead of society, because the young people going out of schools today, the 18-year-olds going into university and then emerging into the workplace, they're the people who are going to forge the society that we want in the future. They will shape it in the future. So they need to have their own independent ideas, their own strength, their own sense of self, not just be ready to fit in and to adapt. So if there is, if you like, a bit of a shock factor when you come out of a girls-only school where empowerment of women is a very strong thing, where you get to think it's normal that you will be heard within the room, that your ideas are as interesting as anyone else's, that you will be able to go to the top of any field that you wish to pursue. Where those girls find a shock in the workplace, I think that's a good thing. And what I want them to do is not adapt, but to use that energy to be agents of change in the world. So schools, whether they're boys' schools, girls' schools, mixed schools, need to prepare young people to challenge, to forge the sort of society that we want to be living in. Because let's remember, they're going to be making the decisions about us very soon. And it's not just a matter of perpetuating what we have now. And as we've said, the pace of change isn't all that we would like. So I think to create an energy which can be innovative, can be creative, and can be very bold in bringing new ideas into the workplace is important. Obviously, it's a balance, because you have to fit in to some extent in order to have credibility. But I think that capacity to challenge is really important.
So let's throw it open. We're happy to take questions on anything, really. Yes. So I'm happy to start on that. In 2013, I did a review for the Liberal Democrats, who were then the coalition partner for the partner in the coalition with the Conservatives. And they had asked me to do a review into their culture and their processes, because of the revelations or allegations, as they turn out to be, against Lord Reynard for sexual harassment that appeared on Channel 4 News. And so I did a big review and concluded, to be honest, that the political world was considerably worse than the corporate world, and that it obviously wasn't specific to the Liberal Democrat Party, but it was endemic across Westminster. And to my sadness, although I concluded with the very clear sort of that this is a problem across politics, it was only the Liberal Democrats at the time that really did anything about it. I don't think the other parties really read it, and I do think it's almost like a squaring, a sort of an exponential version of all the power, the sort of what traits we might describe as masculine traits that women can have and so forth, and it's like the essence of all of that. And I think one of the mistakes that's been made is people have thought that people like Nicky Morgan and Amber Rudd, were very strong women, very tough women, they could deal with it all. And actually they probably needed much more caring for and looking after and somehow protecting from some of this. I think we're in a very difficult environment for women to want to be a politician, and that is to the detriment of the country overall. On the specifics of what's happening now, post those resignations, retirements, etc., then I was actually talking to a woman today who is part of the Conservative Party Women to Win initiative, and she's putting herself forward. There are women coming through, but unless we change it, this goes back to we have to change the system. We cannot have it so that you have to be in a bear pit, enjoying the kind of the thrill of PMQ, the Prime Minister's Question Time. That cannot be a civilized way to conduct our lawmaking and our decision making. So I'm very critical of it. I do think it's way back when, and in the meantime, I think business world, education world, creative worlds can show the way forward.
Except to say that, of course, we in this country we follow others, and where you have the leader of the free world with the attitude to women that we're all aware of, I don't think there's very much hope for better standards being asserted that strongly elsewhere. So I agree with what Helena said, and it's not confined to politics, of course. In all areas of public life, we're gradually boiling up like a frog to accept these things as normal or too normal. It's too possible to be successful and to be totally unacceptable in your behaviour towards women. It's not confined to politics. We see it all over, and that, of course, deters intelligent thinking women from wanting to put themselves into that arena. So I guess the answer is it's a job of educators to build huge resilience in women, but also to build in young men the right attitudes which reject that behaviour, so that in the next generation we're going to see the tide turning. But I think it will take time, and it won't be before December the 12th, I don't think.
Do you want to go first on this one?
I think, yes, I think what's resonating behind that is a sort of wave of religious attitudes as well, and there's a sort of fundamentalist set of values behind those initiatives, which is maybe something that we don't feel so strongly in society here, but you mentioned the United States, where the alignment of religion and politics is much stronger, and I think perhaps that's a manifestation of that. But I think before we go any further, we're really keen to make this a discussion, actually. So I quite like to throw that question back, unless Helena wants to add to it, and see what others think.
Yeah, I'm very interested to hear what others think as well, but I would say that I think any great change is going to have sort of big lurches forward and then steps back. And it's almost the higher the stakes, the bigger the prize, the more people who don't want it will fight against it. And I think we absolutely must not allow ourselves to be, to retreat, as it were. I don't want to use too much militant language. But I think that, it's a tiny thing, but just in the whole city. I mean, when I started working, it was absolutely acceptable for people to take clients to lap dancing clubs in the evening, and everyone would talk about that openly, and it was absolutely just like, it was a very hostile environment if you were sort of quite a shy woman, and very difficult. I used to struggle, big time in terms of a lot of the banter that it would be now described. Now, you might think that's just a small thing, but I actually think culturally, people at the time would have said, well, it'll never change. And it didn't happen very quickly. I was the only woman in a team of 16. At one stage, all my competition running global bond funds weren't just all men, but they were all men called Paul. Absolute gospel truth. There were 5 of them. It's weird, really, but, And then I learned gradually, and that's why we have to come back to allies. We need people in power who aren't obviously fighting the rearguard action, but people who are in power to support us. And that was what the exciting learning for me was from the 30% Club, that the few enlightened chairs, and there were only 7 at the start. Now there's like 250 in the UK. There are 14 different chapters throughout the world. There are only 7, and most of the rest wrote me very aggressive, hostile letters, almost hate mail, accusing me of interfering with what they were doing. It was nothing to do with me, their boards, with their business. And by getting these powerful allies, they eventually managed to persuade their peers to change. And the people who were really diehards, I just end up not bothering about. They eventually got silenced because their power ebbed. So I think it's a perfectly understandable sort of anxiety. I'm definitely not complacent, and I definitely think we've got a lot of challenges still, but we absolutely have to see the opportunity and really go for it, because technology has changed everything, from way that we can work, flexible working, what men want, how the young people expect to communicate, have a career, etc. And this is, I think it's an unprecedented opportunity to build on all the work that our grandmothers did before us and their grandmothers before them. And I just get great hope from the next generation. I speak at a lot of schools, universities, men and women. I'm a governor at a boys' school. And I see a lot of expectation on the part of young men that they expect equality. They expect their sisters, their female friends, their future partners, etc., to also have opportunities. So we have to go with them and build them up as our allies.
I think there's another optimistic point that's just occurring to me as Helena's speaking there, that the discerning nature of young people as they go into the world of work, I think it should give us cause for optimism. When you talk to young graduates about what they're looking for, they want to make a difference in the world. These are the sorts of things that are most important to them, and they do ask in detail about company policy on sustainability, for example. They ask about parental leave. In fact, I was talking to a poor liner, as they're called, the other day, who's 28, very, very successful, early career in media and communications, and she was looking at various different jobs. She chose to go and work for one particular company, although she had offers from several, purely on the basis of a much more favourable and transparent parental leave policy, which age 28 and about to get married was a particular interest to her. So they are asking questions about what the culture culture and values of business actually are. And if those businesses want to attract the best graduates, they're going to have to respond to those discerning questions. So I think the desire to be successful and the desire to pull in the best minds, male and female, will force organizations to be not only more ethically grounded, but also more transparent about those things. So I think that's one cause for optimism, to add to what Helen has been saying. But are there other questions for us?
Sorry.
But I think we should touch on, we should address this issue about parenting being devalued in society, because I think it is a real, I mean, the whole point of progress is not to force everybody down a different path from the one that everyone was forced down before, but to have more choice. And it does, I mean, one of the lines that I often use when I'm giving a talk sort of with slides is sort of that there is no single right path. And actually, it's really important to do things that you feel comfortable and want to do. And I think, as I've hopefully made it clear, that my husband's done something, and I don't see this in any way condescendingly. I actually think he's done the tougher job and lots of the times in terms of being a full-time stay-at-home father. But he feels that parenting, not just men doing it, but women doing it as well, has been devalued, and that is a huge risk to our society. And actually, the thing that we're working on now is something much more about the importance of family and how, you know, whether it's counteracting, you know, social media or whatever, but this danger being that if children don't have parents and people who they love and love them and so forth in their lives enough, then you end up sort of bobbing along like corks on a sea rather than actually being, you know, having strong principles. Now, schools can go a long way, but I do think we've undervalued parenting. My own eldest daughter currently is a full-time stay-at-home mom. She's a musician. Everyone keeps saying to her, in fact, one person said today, when's Flo going to do her music again? I know that she's doing some music, but this for her is a very special time with 2 young children, and people seem to be diminishing that. And that makes me, you know, I feel, why am I having to defend that? That is just, anyway, so we have tied ourselves in knots on a lot of these issues. And choice for more people and more men and women, you know, working out between them. That survey that I mentioned called Equal Lives, some of the best feedback was from gay dads who said, actually, you know, we already broke societal norms, so we just worked out what we both like doing, and we just do it. And then when we get bored of that, we swap. You know, I thought, well, that's very, you know, we've got a lot to learn. We've tied ourselves in all this kind of should I, shouldn't I? Am I guilty at work, guilty at home, failing everywhere, succeeding everywhere? It's messy. We should, you know, just do it. And I by the way, the way I make it work is by not being perfectionist, you know. A journalist came to my home and she insisted on, she was interviewing me for actually when my book came out, and she insisted on sort of following me home, which was a bit worrying because I couldn't get in there before her. Anyway, she wrote, she said, it's very messy. The house is very messy. I said, but I did tell you that, you know, certain things have to give. And I, you know, try to sweat the big stuff. We don't nowadays have a nanny, but you know, when so we had a nanny, actually the same person, which was quite amazing until our youngest was 7. But she's in the sort of Shirley Temple way, very self-reliant. So she said, you know, I don't, you know. Anyway, we're still, my husband does a lot.
Wow, amazing.
So anyway, it's not all perfect, I promise.
Very.
And I lose it when the washing machine breaks. That is absolutely, you know, the big things, I say, but the washing machine, I just can't cope. It's like my major sort of tantrum moment.
I think it's such an interesting issue you've raised, because I think we often thinking nowadays about how career patterns have changed, and how for Generation Z it's much more about a sort of feather pattern rather than a one long curve, and that they're not starting in one area age 21, 22 and staying on and doing that for 40 years. They're experimenting and trying different things, and in a way there's an energy and a courage about that which is admirable and exciting, and they're entrepreneurial and they're portfolio people from day one kind of thing. But I can see that from the point of view of somebody trying to run a business, then you've got a lot of fragmentation, and you're a lot of having to re-coach and reteach skills if you're losing people. So I suppose it's what you're raising is the interesting question of how you capture that energy and that excitement that they have, but also keep their concentration and keep their motivation and keep their loyalty. And I guess that the answer to that is, as with any other business, it's by structuring things so that they can keep learning and keep challenged and keep that focus for longer and feel a real engagement with your purpose, so that they feel really invested in the end result and in the longer term success. And it's not so much about me, my career, and what I can get out of it and what I can do to get stimulated about the next thing, but more about how am I taking those things and being part of something.
Well, when I speak to audiences just of entirely, young people, perhaps at university and so forth, and they ask me all about, how important it is to network and, how to kind of get allies and mentors and so forth, I say, well, the most important thing for your career is build some technical knowledge and to become invaluable to the business that you are joining, or the sector, or, don't think you can shortcut that. And I think it goes back to, it's hard for you when you're running a whole business to make sure that you're listening to what they are volunteering, but also training them to you're not being dictated to, so you're not chopping and changing every time someone's got an idea, but also training them in the craft of what they're learning and realizing, you're going against the tide, as we've said, but I have realized that after a few years, and people kind of come back and they say, well, actually, I've chopped and changed, I've done one thing one year, one thing the next, and hopefully it's in time for you to say, actually, no, now, it's not to be boring and to sort of feel like you can never spread your wings, but actually to have that in-depth knowledge. So I think the onus is back on business owners and leaders to get that point across and make sure that you're not being dictated to along the way.
Wonderful question to finish with.
So thank you. Great questions.
I just want to thank you, Helena and Clarissa, and the audience for sharing your precious time this evening. And also Adam, Mia, Grace, Leo, and the whole Fenwick team, thank you for hosting us, and D1 for the delicious cocktails. Both of Helena and Clarissa's books are available to buy this evening, and also there's a gift for you on the way out, so please don't forget to take it. The Women in Power speaker series will be a monthly event, so I look forward to seeing you here next time. Thank you.